Globalize the Intifada could become illegal in Australia, and people already have been arrested for chanting it in the UK. Now, a recent editorial in the Jerusalem Post urges Mamdani's New York to follow suit. The instinct to ban a chant militantly invoking the mass murder of Jews is understandable. This phrase has become a rallying cry for mobs that celebrate political violence and openly menace Jewish communities. It stains its speakers. It signals something real and dangerous. But in America, this question of banning speech actually hits differently than anywhere else in the West, and we need to talk about that today. Free expression, alongside religious belief and practice, is the core American liberty. It goes to who Americans are at the most fundamental level, for good and for bad. And there's also a harder truth. One of the very reasons that the craziest and most conspiratorial voices have managed to gain market share in the American conservative movement is that they're capitalizing on a tidal wave of anger and confusion following years of overreaching attempts to suppress or cancel speech through social, academic, and professional censorship. So the question isn't simply whether banning a chant feels justified in the aftermath of a massacre. Of course it does. But it is also whether it works, whether it backfires, and whether speech bans become a substitute for the harder work of really protecting Jewish communities in the real world. Now, if criminalization isn't the answer in the US, what is? And what actually can keep Jews safe without sacrificing the liberties on which they ultimately depend? All that and more today. I'm Aylana Meisel-Diament, and this is Basic Law. Now today we have a very special guest, civil rights expert Professor Greg Dolin, to flesh out some answers. I also call him a former Supreme Court justice, albeit in the island nation of Palau. So welcome, Greg. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. All right, full disclosure, very old friends. And so for that reason, I'm going to take one more second before we begin to acknowledge the commenters who last week called me out for my mispronunciation of Bondi Beach. I do consume a lot of my information through reading instead of listening to podcasts, ironically, and sometimes that is expressed in mispronunciation. So I acknowledge it, I apologize for it, and I will try to avoid future Fox passes. Faux pas. Internet. It was a joke. Okay, so Greg, I want to talk about the free speech issue. I'd like to focus actually on Globalize the Intifada as an example, although there is a long history now of this question of where anti-Semitic speech crosses a line. Certainly on campuses, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and then there's been a push within, I'd say, the Jewish establishment for several years to possibly legislate a formal definition for what anti-Semitism is, and that stuff is going to be a little bit beyond the ken of this particular episode. I want to focus it, as I said, on this particular phrase. And it might be best to open with the question of how is the phrase perceived currently under American law?
So before I begin, just like you had a disclaimer about Bondi Beach. You have to also make my disclaimer that while I'm very happy to be here, I'm happy to talk about any topic that comes up. My views should not be attributed to any of my employers, past, present, or future. They're solely my own, based on my understanding of the U.S. Constitution and U.S. laws. So with that, let me actually get to the substance of the question. There is no special way that Globalize the Intifada, or for that matter, almost any other specific phrase, is perceived in American law. I think you hit the nail on the head saying that the freedom of expression is a core value of American constitutional law, out of American self-identification. We are different from Europe in that sense. We have near free speech absolutism. There are some exceptions. For example, you still can't speak about military secrets and disclose them. You still can't, defame someone. You can't say that somebody is a child molester when they're not. You can be held liable, not criminally, but civilly liable for that. You can't steal somebody's protected intellectual property. But other than those very, very narrow exceptions, the United States is nearly a free speech absolutist country. And we can go into why that is and what is the value underlying that and what are the costs and benefits of it. But because of that, there is no special perception of globalized intifada or any other phrase in American law. Now, I will, before going further, I will mention it that I think a common point of confusion, not only amongst foreigners to American law, but even amongst American citizens, is what does our freedom of speech mean and who does that protect and against whom? So it generally protects everyone who's in the United States. There's some debate whether or not it applies to, temporary visitors, which is currently before the courts. But the key point is that it applies against the government. So meaning if I say something, the government can punish me, whether it's they can't punish me criminally if I'm employed by a government agency. So for example, I'm a professor at the University of Baltimore, which is a state college. They can't fire me for my speech, etc. But that doesn't mean that private parties can't have some sort of reaction, including a consequential one for my speech. So, for example, if I'm wearing a T-shirt that says, well, whatever it says, let's say "Globalize the Intifada," and I want to come to a restaurant, and you dislike that, you may try to ban me from this private restaurant, or you can not invite me over to your dinner, or you can fire me, or you can dismiss my membership in a private club. So, when we're talking about that, it's important to understand that it's the government that is limited in what it can do, but not the private parties.
Sure, but let's talk about for a minute at what point speech does become something that crosses the line. The classic example is you can't shout fire in a crowded theater, right?
Well, so that's a somewhat misstated classic example. You cannot shout fire falsely in a crowded theater, right? You actually should be shouting fire in a crowded theater if there actually is a fire. And I think that's an important point that's often gets omitted because if you, for example, even if you are shouting falsely, but you have a good faith belief because you saw that there's a fire or you smelled something or whatever. So you actually believe there's a fire, and you're trying to get people out and not trying to cause a stampede, and even if you're wrong, you can be punished for it. But point taken, there are some situations where speech may cross into something else, but rarely a speech alone. So I was actually thinking about some of these questions over the last couple of days. And so here's an example that comes up. Generally speaking, in America, you can say whatever you want. You can't actually go down the street march and say "gas the Jews," and with placards and chant and whatever. It's disgusting. It's terrible, but it is a protected speech. But consider, for example, you're at a round table at your IBM facility, right? And you're sitting there with a bunch of other engineers and discussing how to make a new, computer chip or something, and somebody or your boss or your coworker uh, keeps interrupting you and saying "gas the Jews." Okay? Even leaving aside the fact that IBM is a private entity and could just fire you because they don't like your speech, period. At that point, because the speech is meant to do something else, it's meant to shut you up. It's meant to make you non-productive. It's meant basically for you to be unable to do your job. It may cross a line into harassment. Right. So again, you can use this. You can look at a situation where it's not political. For example, you can't. You're a terrible person if you do it, but you can go down the street and whistle at women that you think are attractive, and nobody can really stop you legally. But if you start doing it at work and making it impossible for your female coworkers to do the job because you start objectifying them and start essentially making it difficult for them to participate at an equal level in employment or in college or things like that, then it might cross into something else. I'll give you one more example from when I was clerking, working for a judge back early in my career. We had a case where the allegation was that a black family walked into a restaurant, and the first thing they heard is that we don't serve black people here, except that a different word was used, a classic racial epithet, and they brought suit. And one would think, well, if it's free speech, I can say whatever I want, including against black people. And again, the answer is yes. You can march down the street and say black people shouldn't, eat at restaurants or vote or whatever else, or go back to Africa. But as we wrote in that opinion, as soon as you utter that phrase in in a public establishment, that essentially denies service on equal terms to member of black community, which is prohibited by our civil rights laws. So you can say whatever you want, but you can't deny service in a public accommodation like a restaurant or hotel. You can harass people so they can't do their job. Essentially, you can make it impossible for people to participate in civic life. whether employment or other. So you can't intimidate people from voting and things like that.
So I think that the basic premise of this piece, and I don't want to go too hard at the Jerusalem Post itself, which is a great institution, but the premise of this piece was globalize the Intifada is a terrorist chant. It signifies imminent danger to the Jewish community, and so the proper thing to do is to condemn it also potentially through government action. And again, my question to you, just to bring it back to this specific example, would be okay, so you've got dangerous looking and frightening demonstrations happening in streets. You've got them happening near religious institutions. You've got them happening on campuses, where I know that speech uh, regulation is a bit different than it is necessarily in the middle of a city street. At what point can you start under the current American legal regime to limit the expression of that chant or others that seem to be, if not a call to imminent violence, still a call to violence?
So if it's a call to violence, generally you can't limit it. So and there's a classic case on it. One would be hard pressed to find something more upsetting or more terrorizing of Jews than actual Nazis, right? Not somebody that we don't like and just call a Nazi, but actual Nazis. And there's a case, and I'm sure you remember from your law school days, called the National Socialist Party versus Village of Skokie. I actually grew up in the village of Skokie. I lived right across from that synagogue that organized a counter march. And so the basic story is the National Socialist Party of America wanted to march in their full uniform regalia in a village of Skokie, Illinois. And village of Skokie was not picked randomly. Village of Skokie at the time was about 60% Jewish, and of those, about like 40% were Holocaust survivors. So this is we're talking about 1970s, not too far away from the end of World War II. And village of Skokie tried to do everything it could to ban that march, and they came up with all sorts of legal maneuvers to do so. And eventually, the Supreme Court said of the United States, you can't do it. Nazis have as much right to free speech as everybody else. We understand that they're terrible people. We understand it's upsetting to the Jewish community, but that's America for you, right? You're right. On campuses may work a little different. Obviously, there's private campuses and they can set whatever rules they want. But on public campuses, it may work a little different, not because speech is treated differently, but because if the speech is done, for example, if somebody breaks into your classroom, there was an incident, I think at Columbia, when somebody broke in the classroom and interrupted class with chants, whether it was Globalized the Intifada or something similar. Um, that's potential crossing into harassment when it's chant plus blocking Jewish students or other students access to buildings. When it's when there's another example from sad example from Jewish history from 19 I'm thinking 91, I think, the Crown Heights riots in New York when there were riots against Jews in Brooklyn, and there was one person who was at least alleged and I think ultimately convicted of uh, pointing out to a Jewish man who was eventually killed and saying, "There he goes, get the Jew." Right. So when it's specific violence to a specific person, that could be criminalized. But general chance, again, even though that they're, I think we're on the same page that they are, as a general matter, call to terrorism, I think they would fall basically the same way as gas the Jews, which is also a call to annihilation of our people, but nevertheless, kind of in the abstract at least, are constitutionally protected.
Okay. So we're going to get into just general arguments for and against speech bans, and I also want to maybe invoke some examples of places where there are speech bans on things like Holocaust denial, and it's not clear to me that in the places where that exists, you have a less anti-Semitic culture. Right? But one of the key points that bothers me about the call for a speech ban, I'll say even two of them, which I mentioned earlier in the show. So one is I think that it's an instinctive kind of reaction that seeks to penalize a symptom rather than address the disease. And so what ends up happening is you focus a lot of effort on, in the case of the state, something that probably wouldn't pass constitutional muster anyway, but you focus a lot of effort on something that doesn't actually address the problem that is jeopardizing Jewish life. And at the same time, especially in the United States, were there to be people that really picked this idea up and ran with it, uh, they would be feeding, I think, into a larger perception, certainly within very large swaths of the American public, that it's an attempt to thought police, really, because and then that links back to this very fundamental importance that this liberty holds within American life. I don't know if you'd like to react to those two views, if you have what to add, or perhaps if you have what to argue.
Yeah, I fundamentally agree with both of them. So speech is generally, I think it's the liberty without which any other liberty can't exist. Because it's also a liberty, it's liberty by First Amendment, which also protects liberty of religion, liberty of worship. And in some sense, those, although they're listed separately in the First Amendment, they are very similar. What we believe that God commanded us to do or not to do. Some people believe that God commanded them to go and proselytize to others. Well, if that makes some community feel unwelcome or feel threatened, you know, why can't we ban that speech or regulate that speech? So, to your point that it's about fundamental liberty, my kind of response, maybe gloss on that, is that it never stops at saying just, "Oh, okay, well, just one specific terrorist threat at one specific time when it's particular danger to a specific community." It never stops there. It always grows. And I think your earlier point at your opening monologue about that a lot of conspiratorial success is a result, precisely a result of cancellation, is exactly that. It's exactly correct that we've tried to cancel so much, and the line was always creeping. I mean, I know people remember this, but there was a guy, just a random guy, who was fired from his job because he was driving his truck with his hand hanging out of his window, and while his hand was hanging out, it was curled sort of like this, with what kind of two, with his forefinger and his thumb touching each other.
For those listening to the show instead of watching it, it's like the OK sign.
It's like the okay sign, but somebody who, snapped a picture of it, and he was driving his company truck, so it was easy to trace him down, and said he's flashing a white power sign, and the reason it's white power is because if you look at your hand when you do an okay sign, the thumb and the index finger kind of form an O, and then the middle finger forms like sort of the P, the stem of the P, and then the middle finger, pinky, and the third finger or fourth finger form a W. And so somebody came up with this, that this is a white power sign. It started out as an internet joke, and then they contacted the employer, and he got fired despite the fact he wasn't even white. He was a Hispanic guy, and his name was in the L.A. Times. It was a terrible, terrible thing that happened to this person, and it became as a result of speech regulation, right? We got to police everything because it will never stop at this one thing. And to your first point that it doesn't address the root problem, I think I would add it possibly exacerbates it, because if we start banning this speech, somebody will always come up like, aha, see, we're banning the speech for the Jews because they're so powerful and they're controlling it. They're trying to suppress debate. And it would same thing would happen if it's not the Jews. If it's like, I know, Armenians came up with some phrase that they wanted to ban. It would be something like, these are shadow cabal that are doing it together, and they're not getting the true, honest, red-blooded American even discuss and look at the right history. And that's always counterproductive.
So this leads me to the question of there's a bunch left as to whether speech bans even work in the places where they exist. But I want to start with something that I'm sure is close to the hearts of many of the people listening, which is, all right. So we spent a long time explaining that it's unlikely that this kind of speech would be banned. Uh, we're both of the view that probably it's not a great idea to push in that direction. But what actually works, right? It's meaning it's also potentially a distraction from the things that do protect. Now, what are those things? There's obviously non-legal, right? There's, as you were talking about, private action, that people who decide in one way or another to exert some kind of censure on people that use this kind of phrase and more broadly participate in a violent or anti-Semitic or anti-American culture. Okay, but what kinds of things existing under American law are the places to focus effort? Are there laws that are not being properly utilized? Are the laws are not being properly enforced? Okay, are there things happening, let's say, at the level of visa review that have been shown to be helpful, where maybe focusing more effort there would be, again, useful?
Yeah, actually, the visa review is the first thing I was going to say, at least on the legal level. Just because the First Amendment protects the rights of people who are in the country, again, well, I'll put an asterisk on people who are either present on a temporary visa or without a visa at all, present here illegally, because that is currently being litigated. But even assuming it protects them, just for the sake of argument, there's no reason why we should import more people that are not aligned with general American ideals. So there's no reason, nobody's entitled to a U.S. visa. Nobody's entitled to visa-free travel. So there's no reason why the United States should give visa or not deeply review people who, um, you know, um, who do those chants. Like, so for example, somebody like Greta Thunberg, right? Given her current, yeah, I think yesterday I saw her being arrested for supporting Palestine action in London. There's no reason why she should continue to be coming to the United States if the government judges her visits not to be in the national interest. And I think there's a good argument to be made that it's not. Again, I'm lucky I don't have to make those decisions, but nevertheless. So kind of on the governmental level, governmental level can also think about what kind of activities it wants to sponsor. So what kind of grants it wants to give and to what universities. For example, you can tie grants to universities taking seriously their responsibility to investigate actual antisemitic incidents beyond just speech. Again, so you can see what happened in Columbia, you can see what happened on a couple of other campuses. So government can actually be robust in demanding that universities, at least at the first level, address those things. And if they don't, then there should be consequences for that. But also, I think there's a way to enforce uh, written rules of behavior aside from speech. So you can, on a university campus, again, let's leave aside private public distinction, but you can wear whatever t-shirt you want to wear. You can, you can chant whatever you want to chant. You can join whatever group you want to join. But once you start spray painting on Chabad House or Hillel, once you start blocking students from accessing campus, whether those students be Jewish or black or white or whatever, so once your speech turns into behavior, I think there ought to be consequences for that. Um, it seems to me that uh, one of the problems of these protesters, leaving aside the fact that they're woefully uninformed, is that they want to protest without any consequences. But civil disobedience, by definition, involves basically saying that, look, I think this particular law and situation is so unjust that I'm willing to suffer consequences of going to jail, getting expelled from college, losing my job, whatever it is, to protest and to call attention to it. The problem is that they want to do all of that without any consequences, or to the extent that there are consequences, only positive ones, getting more scholarships and whatever. So I think what can be done is actually enforcing rules in a neutral manner to people who disrupt educational or workplace settings.
I think that if I'm not mistaken, there's a case being litigated now which is testing the theory that speech on campus and as well as the distribution of pamphlets and so on, I think I talked about this with Mark Goldfeder on a previous episode, might be considered advocacy of terror.
I'm not familiar with this case. My gut reaction is that if it's just pamphlet distribution, maybe it may very well be advocacy of terror, right? But the question is that enough to fit into any exceptions to the law? And again, I think if it's just speech, and again, I don't know about the case, it's a dangerous path to travel, especially for those of us who are Zionists, because imagine some different administration, either campus administration or state administration or federal or city or whatever, somebody saying, okay, well, somebody who is, passing pamphlets, saying something positive about IDF is really supporting state terror, right? And if you get the right people agreeing with that general proposition that IDF is itself a terrorist group, there'll be consequence for that. And now, again, of course, I don't agree with the proposition, but the point is, it becomes very easy to manipulate prohibitions on speech because you can say, okay, well, I don't like group X, right? Now, again, if you support Hamas, Hamas is designated terrorist group, etc. But the logic still holds, and I think that's the problem when it comes just to speech.
What about the investigation of the groups that are sponsoring these bordering on violent demonstrations outside of religious institutions or on campuses, the student groups?
So that's different, right? Because that's speech crossing into action. So once you start once their financial flows, and although generally, again, pure payment for speech or paying for printing out posters, that generally counts as speech itself. And so Supreme Court has been pretty clear on that. But when you start supporting designated terrorist groups, when the money starts flowing to and from groups like Hamas or I don't know whether Muslim Brotherhood is formally designated as terrorist group, but let's say they are. I don't know that they are, but then it's different because now you're offering monetary support to those groups, whether by giving them money or accepting money from them and allowing them to channel it to wherever they want to. And so those are different, I think, in kind, not just in degree. And so those actions can be prosecuted and otherwise addressed. But again, speech itself is just it's a little different.
So let's talk a little bit about just the general debate on free speech and how well speech bans work. I kind of put down a list of what I thought were generally the arguments on the pro side and the people um, on the other side advocating a more restrictive approach. So, the free speech advocates or the more absolute free speech advocates generally say that obviously this is a core human liberty to have the ability to self-express. You don't want to drive bad speech underground and have that culture basically festering and growing, whatever it is, out of sight rather than being something that you can interact with and minimize. You invite, as you mentioned earlier in the show, government overreach in all sorts of ways. And generally, that you need good speech to fight bad speech, so you don't want to be in a position where you're eliminating good speech from the market. Whereas the people that favor a more restrictive approach, I hope I do them justice, but I think, generally boils down to there are certain things which should be outside the bounds of normative discourse. And to keep them outside, you do need government action. And maybe that should be in only the most extreme cases, but obviously the definition of what's extreme changes. Have I missed anything there?
I mean, since I don't fall on the other side, on the kind of pro restriction side, I also want to do them justice. So I don't know if you missed anything there. But let me just say that I agree with the principle or the premise. I think they're right that there are things that ought to be outside of normal discourse. I think a person who puts on a swastika or goes around in a Klan outfit, or person who says, well, we should have finished Armenian genocide when we had the chance, or any of those things. Those things are all outside of normal discourse, right? Those are not a kind of acceptable in a normal society. But I think where we part company is what I mean by acceptable, and I think what those individuals mean by acceptable. I mean that when I hear somebody say that, I can interact with those people. They're not my friends. They're not. I don't want them to be my colleagues. If I am on a hiring committee in my university, I wouldn't want to hire them, etc. Right? I wouldn't want to vote for them. And you're right. I don't want to drive them underground. I want to know who they are so that I don't have to hire them or vote for them or be their friends. And I think people who are pro speech bans are more, they when they say it's not acceptable, they mean that there should be legal consequences for that. I think that's where we're for a company. I think we agree on the premise, we disagree on a solution.
All right. Okay. So then let's hope, obviously, people that agree with a more restrictive approach, if they feel that we have not done it justice, are welcome to comment and fill in the gaps on anything that we might have missed. But let's look at where speech bans are implemented, right? And I'm going to take just a few examples. So the UK has what Americans consider to be a fairly restrictive speech regime. They've got legislation against hate speech there. Canada, um, there are laws against Holocaust denial in many different countries, but including Israel, by the way. But certainly in Germany and Poland and Austria, I believe in France. And then the question for me is, okay, well, right, those are places where if Globalize the Intifada doesn't already fit under some existing legislation, if they wanted to put it outside the law, it would not necessarily be something new for them, right? Because they've already got laws that are trying to regulate hatred in society. And the question is, well, does it work? I'm not convinced that it does. I don't think that you do have lower incidence of anti-Semitism in many of these places.
Well, I agree with both the kind of the question and the answer. But before going there, let me just highlight one, I don't think such a small point. Let's look at France for a moment. They do have fairly restrictive speech laws. And maybe some people hail them and and they can point maybe to some positive effects of it. But let's not also forget that under the same general rubric and the same kind of general ability to police speech, France has also banned visible religious symbols in public um, accommodations. So, for example, if you want to teach in a French public schools, you can't wear a kippah because it's a visible religious symbol. So, basically, if you're a religious Jew, you have to choose: do you want to be employed in a state employment, which I think in France is like 40% of all jobs, or do you want to maintain your religious obligations? So it's not targeted Jews. Like if you're a Sikh, you also can do it. And if you're a Christian, you can wear a visible crucifix. So this was not an anti-Semitic law. But just consider that the consequences of giving government that power to regulate speech and expression. But so putting that to the side, I think you're right. I don't think it works. People oftentimes point to Germany saying, look, post 1945 with denazification and and hard going hard against any sort of uh, Nazi resurgence. Germany is a successful example of restricting speech. And I think that's probably right insofar as Germany is the most successful example. Doesn't mean they're actually successful. It's just that between all of them, Germany probably is the most successful. But I think that's less in part because of speech restriction and more in part because of, at least for a while, Germany was governed under U.S. military law after surrender. In fact, technically speaking, U.S. military didn't give up its paramount power to govern German affairs until 1990, I think. So when finally Germany reunified and the Soviets, Brits, Americans, and French relinquished their allied control over Germany, so there was a very unique circumstance where uh, particular speech was just suppressed. Now, and there's laws against Holocaust and all that other stuff. But even if you look at Germany, where again, I think is the most successful example, I don't think you're going to find this unmitigated success. There's now Holocaust denial is on the rise. Anti-Semitism is on the rise in Germany. The parties that, whose relationship to Israel at least is questionable, such as AFD. I think there are different wings. Some of them are like view Israel as a bastion of Western thought that they want to protect, but some of them are, they come from the rehashed or reworn kind of neo-Nazi past. And right now, AFD polls as number one party in Germany, ahead of Social Democrats and ahead of the Christian Democratic Union. So I think UK, same thing, right? You ban all the speech you want, but you have people in the thousands parading and waving Palestinian flags and chanting "Globalize the Intifada," and so eh, so I don't think it works except by ceding more power to the government. And if anything, it provokes a reaction back. It's kind of you think of a spring, you press it and press it and press it, and so you start banning one phrase, and then you start a second, a second, second. Eventually, it might very well explode with very terrible consequences.
I tend to agree. I'd come across a poll when I was doing the research for the show. Poll was from CNN in 2018, right? So it well precedes what is now this massive spike in anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism. CNN polled 7,000 people across Europe in, I think it was over 1,000 people each in Austria, Germany, France, Poland, Hungary, Great Britain, and Sweden. What they found basically was that the younger generation, like in France, 20% of those polled between the ages of 18 and 34 had never heard of the Holocaust. 12% in Austria, of I think it was millennials, had never heard of the Holocaust. By the way, America didn't perform much better in similar polling elsewhere. Um, and these are in places where you do have limitations on speech. Okay, but at the same time, a third said that Jews use the Holocaust to advance their own goals. A third of those surveyed said Israel uses the Holocaust to justify its actions. A third said that supporters of Israel use accusations of anti-Semitism to shut down criticism of Israel, and more than a quarter said that most anti-Semitism that occurs is a response to the actions of Israel. And so I think it just sort of spoke, like when I saw this, it was clear to me that the laws in place in many of the places that CNN was looking at didn't do much to affect the underlying culture, which would potentially be threatening or dangerous to Jews.
Yeah, I think I agree, and I think there's some good articles on this. So somebody that is a mutual friend of ours, David Bernstein, a professor of law at Scalia Law, has written fairly extensively on this idea that um, Holocaust education, not that it's unimportant, but it's not clear that it actually does much in terms of changing people's attitudes. Every so often, like when I see a debate about whether we should do more, etc., I'm reminded of this South Park episode from about 10 years ago, where those of you who are familiar will know. So there's a character who is Eric Cartman, who is generally viewed as like the worst human being on the planet, and the class is being taken to a museum of intolerance. And so he goes through this hallway where various epithets are shouted to show people how hurtful it can be when you're kind of in a surrounded area and people shout epithets to you, whether anti-black or anti-Hispanic or anti-Jewish, etc. And everybody comes out of this hallway kind of horrified, but Eric Cartman comes out and says, like, this is the best ride ever. I want to go again. Right? Now, again, in the show, Eric Cartman is a minority. He's viewed as a terrible person. But I think the same thing happens in real life. There are some people who, um, you know, I wouldn't say necessarily immune to education, but it's showing them the horrors of the Holocaust, simply just reinforces their view that, well, maybe Jews did something too. They're like, couldn't have just been out of nowhere.
Or for that matter, trying to kind of too forcefully even ban the questions themselves does not necessarily achieve the desired effect.
Exactly, right? And look, if we're talking about speech generally, I think it's a longer conversation, but anti-Semitism, I'll be pessimistic, it's never going to go away. It's hatred goes back thousands of years. And it's always justified by something else, like Jews don't have any power, and so it must be because God chose to punish them, and so we should follow God's plan. Or Jews have too much power, or Jews are stateless, and so why should they be stateless? Why are they living here in Poland or in Iran or wherever, right? And now all Jews have a state. Why do they have a state? So it's always mutates, and so I don't think we're going to defeat it. I think we should engage in a battle of hearts and minds, knowing full well that we're just not going to change some of it. Some is going to be a reaction. It's like, well, maybe Holocaust happened because maybe there was something there. Maybe, I've hear now, like it's conspiratorial. Like Hitler didn't actually hate the Jews. He hated the Bolsheviks and the Jews' control of the bank. And if they, and if England didn't start bombing Germany, maybe like he would have just been, he would have been happy with just minimizing Jewish power, which is total nonsense, of course, right? It's a total insane nonsense, but so we should engage that and kind of and with facts and documents from that time. But knowing full well that some people will, that they will find new reasons and ways to hate the Jews and justify their hate.
I was going to say, if I ever wanted to blackmail you, I would just go back to the show and just snip
Yes.
every example that you've brought of a terrible thing and just stitch it together.
Right. Yes. Please don't do it if I'm ever before the U.S. Senate.
I can't make promises, Greg. It might be an excellent point of leverage. Okay, look, I have one last question. I really appreciate your time, so thank you. The question is this, uh, and I want to emphasize that this entire show, which has been going into the fundamental importance of free speech and what is effectively a warning not to use that particular tactic in trying to wage a just battle for self-defense of the Jewish community in the States at the very least. So I don't want to get to the point where you say, okay, well, so don't use speech, let them say whatever they want to say, and, you know, come what may come. Are there measures, in your view, are there legal measures that should be advanced that have not yet been advanced that would be protective, whether in the realm of speech or probably not in the realm of speech?
I agree that we shouldn't just say like let everybody speak and come what come. I agree, let everybody speak. I disagree, like come what come, right? I think we should call out people who say that. Like I think we mentioned, both of us mentioned before, that I don't want to drive this speech underground. I want to know who those people are. I want to know their names, and I want to point out like this person said that terrible thing, right? Just the other day in the Mamdani administration, a person who was, that dug up her former anti-Semitic statements, he hired her to be his, not chief of staff, but I think head of hiring or some position, his administration. And people found her speech and she had to resign because of the sort of public pressure. That's what I want, right? I want public pressure to be brought. I want people to suffer consequences during elections. I want people to suffer consequences in their professional careers, not because they necessarily get fired, but because, people don't invite them to sit on panels and people don't, engage with their articles and etc. On the legal side, I think we've covered some of them. I think U.S. should be more robust in figuring out who comes in and who doesn't. I think we can be more robust in figuring out once you're in, like, what does it take to become a U.S. citizen? So, just, a couple months ago, it was not at all related to this. I don't even know why I was reading this, but I saw this provision in U.S. law, probably not been enforced for quite some time, but basically, in order to become a U.S. citizen, you have to swear an oath that you're going to uphold the U.S. Constitution, that you do it freely, that you're committed to American way of life and the political way of life, so the government, etc. And I guess there was this provision that if within I think 2 years or so, you were to join a communist or fascist or other party, then the presumption is that it's not that you thought about it deeply and decided to, like, okay, well, communism is the way to go. The presumption is that you lied on your initial oath, that you were never really committed, right? And so it's within 2 years because kind of the idea is that you happened so quickly. It's like you couldn't have been within 2 years, you were totally committed to American democratic way of life, and then 2 years later, you became a communist. So the presumption becomes that you've actually lied on your oath and you're liable to denaturalization. So I don't know whether this has been tested in court, and if so, like how robustly and what was the last time it was done. But kind of this idea that the oath shouldn't be a mere formality. It shouldn't be just a way for your family to snap some pictures. It should mean something. And we can examine whether or not you're actually committed to the American way of life before we make you part of the American polity. So I think there are things to be done that stop short of bans or criminalization, especially for people who are not U.S. citizens. There's some behavior you have to tolerate in your own children because they're your children and you're kind of stuck with them. Doesn't mean you have to tolerate them or invite more bad behaving kids into your house, right? If they are indeed bad behaving. So I think United States and for that matter other countries should really think about who they're bringing in. Are these people, and this has nothing to do with race or ethnicity or religion, but it has to do with kind of with values and attitudes. Are these people really willing to integrate? Are they willing to actually adopt American or British or whatever way of life? Are you willing to be part of continuing American experiment without advocating for violence?
All right. As I said earlier, but I'll say again, very, very much appreciated your time and your insight. I hope we'll have a chance to have you back. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. This was fun, more fun than I expected, and I expected a lot of fun.
Oh, well, in that case, it's going to have to happen again soon. So I'm going to just close with for those viewers of the show who I think this show is being released before Christmas. So for those who are going to be observing Christmas, I hope they have a joyful holiday and a smooth entry into the new year. And we will see each other next week.